Hi, everyone. I'm Sree Sreenivasan, and I'm the co-founder and president of SAJA, the South Asian Journalists Association. And I'm the CEO of Digimentors, a social digital AI training consulting business. And you are listening and watching and experiencing. Trust me, I know what I'm doing.
Welcome, everyone, to this episode of Trust Me, I Know What I'm Doing. Boy, I'm excited today welcoming Sree Sreenivasan as a guest on the show. I've been wanting to do this for a long time, and I'm certainly delighted that you're joining. Sree, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I love the title of your program, and I know it applies to you because it certainly doesn't apply to me. I can't even joke about knowing what I'm doing. At least the title is a little bit a little bit of self-deprecation in there. I know that, but this is kind of fun. And as a doctor, you do know what you're doing. And now 260 guests, 3 years, something like that on your podcast. That means that you know what you're doing here as well.
Yeah, it's been a journey, and yes, we can absolutely joke about it. It's perfectly fine for us to be ourselves. So, but in thinking about what we do, we can be both humble. We can humble brag a little bit, and I know that for you, there's been a lot to be very proud of. I'm curious about what makes you proud in being proud of being a South Asian American.
Yeah, that's a good big question to start with. By the way, when we talk about trusting doctors, I always ask doctors what is their favorite movie about doctors' portrayal, and almost no one ever says Malice. Have you seen that, the
Right?
Alec Baldwin film?
I have.
With the
Yeah.
all-time greatest line about God complex, where he says, "People accuse me of having a God complex. I don't have a God complex. I am God." So,
Yeah.
I presume
Yeah.
that is not your favorite portrayal of a doctor.
No, it really is not. And in light of things that are going on around the world, I hope nobody is, thinking of those lines when it comes to themselves or their profession. But yeah, I mean, at a time like now, and thinking about sort of like the intersections of past, present, future, what does make you proud of who you are and kind of what you represent?
No, thank you. It's speaking on India's Independence Day, and I've stopped being an Indian citizen more than a decade ago,
Yeah.
but I was really a citizen of the world because I was born in Tokyo. My dad had no problem picking me out in the window, and he said, the brown one is mine. And we lived all over the world. And that Indian passport got me all over the world because of my dad's work and because of his passport that he had.
Right.
And I've considered myself a New Yorker more than anything else. I arrived here at the age of 9 and then moved to other places. I went to high school in Fiji, which is as great as it sounds. And
It
then I went to
is.
college in
Yeah.
India. And then I came back and came to teach and work at Columbia, study, and then teach and work at Columbia for 20 years, Columbia University's journalism school. And then I've had a whole other career after that, maybe multiple careers. So when I think about Independence Day, it kind of all melds into one: India's independence, America's independence. And at this moment, we're thinking about what does independence mean when we are on the brink of being in really big trouble as a country, as society, as a planet, in terms of our lack of independence. We are being buffeted by all kinds of forces, natural, not natural, man-made, mostly man-made, that are rocking our world and not in a good way.
Mm.
And the risk of us losing our independence, our ability to have our own destinies and choose what we can do, is in severe question at the moment.
Yeah.
Whether it will be like that, you could say you're being you're portraying like a really bad future, but we are being controlled in ways that we wouldn't have expected in terms of how technology is controlling us, how big companies are causing climate change and what that's going to do to
Yeah.
planet. All of those things are kind of in my head right now when you ask that question.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's something I definitely think about. I grew up in part in the Soviet Union. under Brezhnev. And I used to speak fluent Russian. I used to come home saying Lenin is God, and I was a full communist.
Sure.
And as a little kid, I
Yeah.
was 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, things like that. And I've seen control, and I've seen governments when they don't want to listen to other ideas, when they're not open-minded, when they want authoritarian figures. That's why I have a strong reflex when I see certain politicians behaving in certain ways, because I've lived through that. I mean, I was
Yeah.
obviously protected and cocooned and everything else, but I saw it with my own eyes.
Yeah.
Eventually, I ended up in New York, where I started saying John Lennon is God and became a capitalist and forgot my Russian. But every day in the 80s, we saw the choice that we had, where we would go as a planet and what system would win.
Mm.
And the capitalistic system won. I'm glad the Soviet Union collapsed, but we're now seeing that no system is perfect.
Yeah.
And the crises, multiple crises caused by what we call, as you know, late stage capitalism, is its own problem. And if you had told me then, when I was rooting for the Soviet Union to fall, that here you're going to be in this situation, and meanwhile there's going to be somebody in Moscow who wants to not just put back the communist Soviet Empire, they want to put together the great Russian Empire of centuries earlier. Like that's the goal there. So all of this is you got me started. So that's what.
Well, yeah, I guess I get a lot more than I bargained for with that one. What I love about that is that there's just so many stories, so much multiplicity there, so many different identities that you can certainly that you're grappling with, and that we all probably are, right? We have both opportunities that face us right now. We have a lot of, I think, things that we're grappling with. You're someone who's had a front row seat to the media and how journalism works and how information gets disseminated. And in thinking about our diaspora, for a diaspora that's just so increasingly and incredibly diverse, and thrives on specificity of things like language and religion and custom, and you have a Nataraj in your background there are things that resonate with all of us, for that. Are journalists and media offering the best window and mirror of this diversity, of this celebration of different multiplicities and different sort of pieces for individuals? Or are they gravitating towards sort of the convenience of monolithing us and making us sort of a collective, particularly at a time when coalitions and these kinds of groupings are built to, in fact, enlist power and enlist influence in a way. Do we lose something when the media actually does that to us?
Well, the media is not one thing, it's a lot of different
Yeah,
things. Collectively, if we're talking about traditional journalism, it has failed us in many ways. It has done so much good for the world. The American style of investigative reporting, telling stories, narrative journalism, all of that has benefited India, and I mean, America and the world, and other
yeah,
countries, including India, have copied it. But we've also seen the great damage it has inflicted on the planet from not understanding the value of looking at stories from what do they mean for everyday people. You asked specifically about diversity. One of the things that American journalism has done a terrible job with is understanding that America is not black and white. There's
mm,
all kinds of diversity. And yes, they have understood about Latino Americans here, and that has been an improvement. But there aren't just three races in America.
right.
And that's just an example of the blinders that American journalism has. And a lot of it has to do with the systems that have built it. It has also to do with there are journalists who want to do deeper stories, more meaningful stories, but the economics of American media has collapsed in so many ways that they don't have the ability to do it. The funny part is that journalism was among the most profitable businesses in America for a
Right.
century. The
Yeah.
ability to make real money from these kind of almost newspaper monopolies, for example, television advertising, all of those things should have allowed people to make better news, better television all of those years, and they didn't. Today, there's more awareness, but there
Hmm.
isn't wherewithal to do it. There's a
Yeah.
famous journalist named Fred Friendly who was played by George Clooney in the movie Good Night and Good Luck, which I recommend to your viewers if they haven't
Yeah.
seen it. And in it, he says American television makes so much money doing its worst, it has no incentive to do its best.
Yeah.
And we see that in a lot of media efforts today. And they're not making the money they used to. So
Right.
when they had the money, they didn't. And now, or they didn't know they should. Today, when they know better, they don't have the resources to do it. They're in an
Hmm.
existential fight for their lives. And that's where we are now.
How do you, as someone again who's been, a scholar of this and someone who's interrogated this exact question and has the, great introspective skills to, think about this, how do you fix that? How is that a grassroots upheaval? Is that a complete change of the dynamics of power within journalism? How do you get more of that storytelling that drives its specificity versus completely just playing to the convenience of the economics and again treating things like they are just a mechanism to make money.
And well, that's that capitalistic world we talked about. I don't know if we have the answer, but there are several efforts going on, including nonprofit journalism at the local level and at the national level. And there's also an effort called civic journalism. There's an effort called
Mm,
solutions journalism.
yeah.
So when you add up all of these, there's sincere efforts being made. We just hope it's not too late in terms of the distrust that the public has about media because everything on the internet looks the same. Anything you post, like everything is of equal weight, whether it's a troll or it's NBC News, it's all has equal weight in how it's distributed on your timeline.
Yeah.
So you don't know. And on top of it, you add people like Elon Musk who are deliberately gaslighting the world and spreading misinformation and disinformation himself on purpose,
Mm,
then it's not it's going to be very difficult for consumers of all of this stuff to understand what's real and what's not. And the problems with misinformation and disinformation are very, very at an all-time
yeah.
high, and it's just going to
Yeah.
keep getting worse. One of my favorite memes is young Bart Simpson saying to his dad, "Boy, this is the hottest summer of my life." And his father says, "You mean it's the coldest summer? You mean it's the coldest summer of the rest of your
Of the
life?"
rest of your life, right?
And that's where we are now, like with
Yeah.
AI, where people are saying ChatGPT is scary. And I'm saying it's the least scary, least available, least dangerous it will ever be. And that's could be true about disinformation, misinformation, all of these things.
We were talking about sort of, do you really trust yourself and you don't trust what you're doing or whatnot? You obviously are speaking with a lot of passion, and this has been something that has, I'm sure, grown with self-reflection and with experience and with many iterations of going through this. I'm always quite interested in how these things, are born. And I'm so curious for you, when do you remember first feeling like a journalist?
Well, I do remember when I told my parents I wanted to be a journalist. I was 12 years old. I announced it, and they started crying immediately. They'd much rather have Dr. Abe as their son,
Right,
or the
right.
young doctor to be Abe. And I just knew I wanted to tell story. Posted on Instagram. What I found was an old certificate in fifth grade. I won a storytelling competition, and
Hmm,
now everybody uses the word storytelling, but that was what it was called. And I printed that from PS6 in Manhattan, and I knew this is what I wanted to do. That could have been telling stories, could have been in advertising, could have been in other things, but it
sure.
really evolved towards that. One of my friends says that he was inspired to be a journalist by Kermit the Frog, who was a journalist on Sesame Street.
That's right.
He had a
Yeah.
trench coat and a hat. Or Peter Parker, who was a photojournalist. Or you have, of course, Clark Kent. And so a lot of people who you admire as a 10 or 11-year-old were journalists, and so you
Mm.
you saw that as kind of a fun thing, because I think you're really hoping you get to do the other part,
Right.
not just the journalism part.
Yeah.
But I
And
do.
maybe you do, by the way. We don't know, right?
Yeah, so I think that I remember coming from Moscow to India for a wedding, and people would ask about life in Russia, a life from the Soviet Union, and I would, because I didn't know much to tell, but I would tell them as jokes.
Yeah.
Soviet life was filled with jokes, because if you didn't laugh, you would cry. And
Yeah.
so there are legendary jokes about life in the Soviet Union. And I remember as a seven-year old, standing among a circle of my relatives and relatives at a wedding,
Mm.
and just cracking one Soviet joke after another as a
Yeah.
way of telling people what life like. I mean, even today, you don't meet a lot of people who lived in Moscow,
Right.
but certainly in 1977 didn't meet a lot of people who did that either. And
Yeah.
so you say, "What's life like in Moscow?" And then I would have like one joke after another.
Right. You have your
And so
routine.
that was a kind of journalism, and telling your stories about life and what you've observed. And so that was probably the earliest time that I felt like that. I've never thought about it, but probably the earliest.
With in that same um, vein of thinking, again, whether it's telling a stream of jokes, whether it's reporting, on your experiences, as you've developed this and cultivated this over years and years now, whether it's as a student, a scholar, a dean, all the different hats you wear. Is the same actual like method apply? I mean, as a physician, when I approach a patient, it's no different than when I was a medical student. Whether it's today versus 25 years ago, is it kind of the same approach as well for you? I mean, obviously the maybe the contours around it have changed, but is the formula still the same here?
Yeah, it's a great way of looking at it, and I would say that it is in many ways. So
Yeah.
that emphasis on storytelling and trying to get information out, pull information out of people, and then getting them to talk. That's one of the great things. You get paid to talk to people, which is shocking for some folks, horrifying for others. But if you are that kind of personality, you love that. And so I spent 20 years as a professor at Columbia Journalism School after studying there. And then I was the first chief digital officer of Columbia, working on the future of education.
Yeah.
Then I moved to the Met Museum to be chief digital officer, working on the future of culture. And then the city of New York, working on the future of cities and citizens. And in all of those jobs, it was about pulling out information, distilling it, spitting it back out in
Hmm.
ways that have a narrative and help you understand what are the things that you're facing. How do you solve problems?
Yeah.
I try to be a natural problem solver, and my family will often say, "This is just an observation. We don't need you to solve this problem right now. Just let it sit with it for a while
Yeah.
instead of jumping in." I mean, a lot of people. I had a boss once who said, "When I write you an email, I want you to think about it, not reply in 30 seconds,
Right.
because I want your best advice. I want your
Yeah.
best counsel, and by just thinking that the value is in responding quickly rather than responding thoughtfully, that
Mm.
really helped me a lot." And so after a stint at the mayor's office, I said that was my last time working for anybody
Mm.
and last time wearing a tie, apart from weddings and funerals. And I started my own social digital consulting business. It's called
Right.
Digimentors. And in it, we are doing stories every day, storytelling every day, helping our clients, whether they're a small organization or a huge organization or the UN,
Yeah.
helping them understand what's going on in their industry and how
Yeah.
do you increase their impact in the world. That's the only goal we have, and that's what we do. And by the way, as a doctor, we have a lot of doctors who have become writers
Yeah.
and storytellers and TV journalists and all of that. And a lot of it comes from having high empathy, having that high EQ, having the ability to pull out information from reluctant patients, and then explaining things back to them, right?
Yeah.
Understanding the circumstances and explaining that. And Abraham Verghese, the great Abraham Verghese, who I've had the honor to know for 25 years, has mastered that, as we know.
Absolutely.
And then his current book, oh my God,
Yeah.
The Covenant of Water, just as an example of his ability to, whether it's a 2,000 word article or an essay or a whole novel, and that's he's had that
Yeah.
other previous novel as well. Uh, a note to everyone who's watching who might ever feel kind of disheartened by their lack of success in something. I remember talking to Abe when podcasting was new. I'm talking 15 years ago.
Yeah.
And I interviewed him and he said, Sree, this is my last book tour because these book tours are a waste of time. You go on these tours, you're in Iowa in a rainstorm and there are 10 people there. 8 of them are hiding from the rain and you're there and you're talking. It's just a waste of everybody's time.
Yeah.
I I know where my books are and this is like I know my success. I have hit my level.
Mm.
And that man's book went on to be on the New York Times bestseller list for 4 years. That's not this one.
Right.
That's Cutting for Stone.
Yeah.
And just tells you that you just don't know what is going to click, what is going to hit, what is going to reach people. And what you had mentioned earlier about the just doing the work, right? Like just
Hmm.
getting out there and practicing and just doing it again and again, that treadmill effect which can seem kind of soul draining is actually
Yeah.
helping you. And that's why in medicine, compared to journalism, there is a difference.
Mm.
Doctors, as they get more old, as they get older, typically they specialize more and more and see specific things, kind of a deeper expertise, right? They go deeper and deeper, especially surgeons and people like that.
Yeah.
That's what they're concentrating on. And that's why you go to them, right? Like this is the person to go to if your child has a problem in X. Like that's the person. I remember our son had an issue in utero, and
Mm.
we sought out this amazing pediatric surgeon who just does this one thing. Was in his
Right.
60s, and he just does it really, really well.
Yeah.
And so in journalism, typically the problem has been is that you're just this wide, not expertise.
Catch
Your
up.
knowledge is an inch deep and a mile wide.
Yeah.
Whereas not just medicine, but a lot of other professions, you get rewarded for
Yeah.
being more and more specialized. And so that's been an interesting comparison.
At the end, in specifically thinking about who we are and what connects us as, Indian Americans, South Asian Americans, there is a connectivity and a bond that certainly speaks to who we are and what we do. You're, of course, someone who's very passionate about this in the journalism world with Saja and all the work that you've done there. In thinking about, you know, the same link of medicine, when I go into a patient room, I am agnostic to the fact that I'm an Indian American doctor, right? So, are there times in the spirit of being agnostic and objective and really, really digging into stories that it's important to forget that you are a South Asian American journalist, and yet it's also equally important to celebrate that with peers and with others, and ensuring that there is camaraderie and kinship in that same space.
Yeah, absolutely. So Saja, that you mentioned, the South Asian Journalists Association, we started that 30 years ago, and I stepped off as president 21 years ago. But for my sins, I've been brought back as
I think
president
right. Somebody roped you back in.
this anniversary year, October 11th and 12th, 2024. If you're watching this before that, please come out. We love having non-journalists as well as journalists at the organization. And
Yeah.
we like to say that there are about 1,000 parents crying because their kids didn't, whatever other profession they should.
Right.
And, I can tell you that I'm not a South Asian journalist, but I'm a journalist.
Hmm.
But I have chosen to spend my energy and working for South Asian Journal. I used to do a lot of television tech reporting. So
Yeah.
I was the tech reporter between the weather guy and the traffic gal. I was like, and the sports guy, like, that's
I
who.
think all three major New York
Yeah,
stations,
exactly.
right? Yeah.
Exactly. And I was blessed to be able to do that. And while it was exciting to be on the Today Show dozens of times and all of that, I would, I used to tell people I'd give that up today if I could, if there was an Indian version of that here in America, an Indian American version
Mm,
of that, South Asian American, I would,
yeah.
instead of writing for the New York Times, I would love to write for the Indian version of the Indian American version of the New York Times, or things
Sure.
like that. And often it's a matter again of economics and
Yeah.
professionalism and all of that. And that's all evolved and changed over the years. That it's been great to see these new, exciting South Asian media ventures out there,
Mm,
and be able to kind of move between those as much as needed. And the community itself has changed so much. It isn't one community.
right.
uh, when when I arrived here in 1980, there were one or two journalists working, but they were in different places. They didn't know each other. And now, thanks to Saja and all the changes that have happened, we're all now much more connected and able to talk to each other.
Yeah, and we're all I know grateful for it, and it's a nice time at least, and certainly celebrating 30 years, and come back to that one in a second. One thing that you talked about just now really struck me because I think for someone who's grown up all over the world, you have such a global world perspective, and at a time when we're you know at in those days, right? 70s, 80s, growing up, no matter where you were, we were all a little bit more digitally naive. And yet, definitely less connected. But I'm just curious, like, did that prime a very different empathy for you? Particularly because of the relationships that you had to develop in those formative years, right? You couldn't necessarily escape into the digital sort of, space. Like a lot of relationships get, I think lost in that way. And also to give credit to that, there are a lot of new relationships formed that way. But for you, whether it was, growing up globally, whether it was in India, whether it was here in Manhattan, um, did that empathy was that just different and became a little bit more powerful perhaps because of the resilience of the relationships that you had to form?
That's a really interesting way of looking at the kind of analog life versus the digital life that we all live in. The words
Yeah.
digital native versus digital immigrants. I'm an immigrant and a
Right.
digital immigrant. I did a
Yeah.
TEDx talk on that, TEDx New York, about life as a digital immigrant. Let me see if I can actually, your audience obviously listening in audio, but I'll just show you here. That's me on the stage. I don't know how much you can see, but that's me on stage.
I can.
And then above is a selfie I took in when I was 15 years old in Fiji. I used to have hair. That's proof I used to have hair at one point. But that was a selfie that I took, obviously against,
Yeah, yeah.
and that was kind of fun to talk about life and comparing digital immigrants, digital native. But
Yeah.
I one of the things I learned, I lived in 7 countries in my first 18 years. My
Mm,
twins have lived in one apartment basically in their 18 years. I moved too much, they moved too little. So I always tell people that if you can move your child at least for 6 months to another zip code, another country code, uh, it'll just teach them that everything's not the same
yeah.
all the time. I, of course, learned that the hard way, moving every 2 to 3 years, and so I had a very tough time trusting and building those relationships because they would disappear really fast. My parents would joke about oh, that friend in Nairobi, such a good friend. And we don't remember them anymore because,
Right, right.
yeah, it's very tight, very close, especially
Yeah.
as a diplomat, as an expat. A lot of expats have gone through this.
Yeah.
But I remember coming um, back to America. So I was here when I was 9, and it came back when I was 21. And I
Yeah.
mean, 9 to 14, and then I came back at 21. And I
Right.
tried this wonderful Filipino friend who lived down the hall from me. And I had his old school photo, and I put it out. I couldn't even remember his full name. Also, I
Mm.
put it out there and saying, "This is my friend Raul. Does anybody know him?" Use the Filipino networks and everything. We never
Right,
found him.
right.
Somebody said he grew up to be uh, no,
Wow.
but that was just so. That was how tenuous our connections were.
Yeah,
Relationships, friendships were all fleeting,
yeah.
and that made it much easier for me to adjust in places. But of course, it was also harder to do that.
Mm.
And so, when the first chance I have a to build roots, I did that in New York when I had this job at Columbia. You know, tech background and interests and everything else. I could have moved multiple times for multiple jobs,
Mm.
opportunities where making triple more than the money that I was making, all of that. But
Right.
I didn't go because I just wanted to be in one place. And I had the same email address, same phone number for 20 years, where anybody else with any digital sense or anything had moved five, six email addresses, five, six jobs.
Mm.
I just stayed in one place. My office, my phone number, everything stayed the same. I still have
Right.
that
You kind of
email
needed
address
that.
uh, from from 1995. I had that, but I will say, as you think about that, I learned the value of media and having access to information from. We used to get the Illustrated Weekly of India, which is a magazine,
Hmm.
a life
Yeah,
magazine. Overseas, my dad would get it, like a week late. We
yeah.
I would thumb through that. The Hindu newspaper had a
Hmm.
weekly edition. We'd get that a week late. And so when I saw the internet and saw you can get in real time news from India, news from anywhere in the world, it was really important. But the credit for all of that goes to my grandma. Lived in, and she heard about this thing called, and she said that's a way that she can be in touch with her grandson who's not
Right.
tough. Because if you remember, it costs $3, $4 a minute to make a phone call.
That's right.
Uh, call the boy email shop who would come to our house. She would dictate. In kind of her English was not that good, but she would dictate something. He would write it down with making mistakes, obviously.
Yeah.
The original language and everything else. And so he would
Sure.
go back and then he would key it in, making even more mistakes. And then I would get an email at Columbia. And so I saw the
What a
value of
great
it,
story.
not because of Columbia, but because of my grandmother, who
Yeah.
only passed the aid, who saw that this thing is going to connect her with her faraway grandson. And that
Yeah.
propelled my interest, amplified, accelerated my interest in all things digital. And so I always say that I'm not a engineer. I play one on TV, and I benefited. Bias stereotypes that, oh, he's an Indian, so he must know technology.
Right.
But my job has been to explain technology to people, and I was able to
Mm.
do that because of my grandmother, who just saw instantly something that I'm talking about 1995. There were people
Right.
who had email and who had access to email and didn't know who to send it to. One last story about this is that the newspaper I worked for in India, right, had desking and had an email system, but we used to only send emails to each other, like short notes. It was sort of like texting, but to each
Mm.
other's letters.
Yeah.
And one day I was reading The Economist. The Economist come to the office, and
Yeah.
I opened it, and they said there was an article about a newfangled technology communications style, and they said you type a colon, you type a dash, and a close parens,
Hmm.
and you turn your head, and that's a face. And I remember
Right.
reading that and turning my face. I remember that moment in 1991 when I
Yeah.
saw what they called an emoticon. They didn't call it
Right.
emoji,
That's
and
right.
an emoticon. And I saw, like, this is the future. Like,
Yeah.
people will be able to communicate in ways that smiley face, which now is, you don't have to turn your head, and there's multiple emotions in that little tiniest space. There's so much emotion in there, and it's
Yeah.
animated, move and jump and everything else. That all is a straight line back,
Yeah.
and shows you the connection between the digital world, the physical world. It's all intertwined.
And it's a story for you, right? I mean, like that resonates quite a bit, right? It's a far cry from, either the telephone calls or the aerograms that people send, and you know,
Aerograms.
like the idea of your Malayali grandmother sharing something with a page, if you will, and getting that message translated back so she could make a connection with her grandson. I mean, all of this is definitely now completely changed over the last 25, 30 years with a digital age. And I'm we're you and I are both digital immigrants, right? I mean, like, we have sort of that same ability to think about how we've embraced that, and for that matter, wax a little nostalgic about those other kinds of communications, if you will.
Kids that if in Fiji, if you didn't have plans by like Wednesday or Thursday for Saturday, you had no plans because there's no way to
Right.
communicate, right? You have to do it in school and you have to make the plans. Today, my kids don't have plans at 2 p.m. on Saturday, and they have all the plans by 3 o'clock, right? Or five,
Yeah.
whatever.
Or even faster.
Yeah,
Right. Right.
right.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, those are all the kinds of things that we experienced having grown up in a different era. My digital immigrants, digital natives thing is that people, because just like real immigrants, sometimes appreciate a country more than
Totally.
because you have to study for a test or
Yeah.
you read history in a different way. You just take it granted if you're
Yeah.
born in a place. Here we fought and struggled, not me, but a lot of other people here. And so you like, and therefore, when we're new to technology, we don't understand it. We might read the manual if there are still such things. We might
Mm,
ask questions rather
yeah.
than just expect it time or
That's
just
right.
natively know that it will work, right? So that's the comparison I was making.
Yeah, no, and it's a beautiful one. I mean, it's the facility that we have, the ease with which we, flow in these different spaces. And the appreciation we have for it, I think, is a little bit different. When you think about being a digimentor and a social media guru and someone who is, helping people communicate in these spaces, as information gets more and more democratized and governance exists more horizontally, do you think that institutions like the New York Times or Columbia University have the same relevance and power that they used to
Hmm.
because of this idea that the communicative power can exist in seconds. People make plans and they change, and people the troll has the same resonance as NBC News. I mean, all these things, and our institutions reckoning with this, and therefore individuals who are either entering the space or who have incredible experiences like you do. Do you have to constantly recalibrate what you think the power of an institution actually is?
Wow, that's also a deep question. We are seeing the limits of what impact these organizations can have and where they go. We're talking, by the way, hours after news arrived of the resignation of the president of Columbia University,
Yeah,
resigned. And by the way, right wing people like John and Elise Stefanik are taking equal credit, as are the on the so
sure.
she made no friends in the process.
Right,
It
right.
shows you that these are limits of where they fit in the world. What are we trying to do? What are we trying to teach? And they need to evolve and
Mm,
change and adjust. Otherwise, they are going to be left behind. But there is an immense power that these places have. There's a gravitational pull. When you talk about too big to fail, it's these big elite. When I was chief digital officer, I was brought in part, by the way, because there was the rise of something called MOOCs. You might remember them,
mm,
the massive open
yeah,
online courses,
yeah, yeah.
Coursera, edX, all of these things. There's a fascinating story. The university was upset that the president wasn't moving fast enough on these and fired. And it was just so weird. It had only started September 2011.
Yeah,
Heard Sebastian Thrun, a great German American Google engineer, launched that. And by June, she was fired at UVA. It's
right.
like nothing flows through
Mind
American
blowing.
academia as that fast, and this did. And so I was brought in as CDO to kind of think about what this means. And very early, I understood that this is going to uh, help and shape American education, but nothing like the revolution people are expecting, and
Yeah.
certainly not affect the big inertia-filled organizations that are those top 50, top 100 universities. The
Yeah,
smaller
or
places
any
will benefit.
institution by that matter,
Yeah,
right? I mean,
exactly.
New York Times
Yeah,
and Washington Post,
yeah.
these are
All of
all
those. Yeah,
giant.
yeah.
Yeah,
All of those. But we're, they're going to be institutions being built over the next few years,
yeah.
and it's going to be exciting to see where things go. I'm by nature an optimist about
Hmm.
most of life. Sometimes you can get kicked in the teeth and then realize that you shouldn't always just be smiling, because then the teeth are.
And it really brings up so many different thoughts about how then your own persona, your own opinions, the opinions and the thinking of those who you love, get formed and shaped, and how they actually, in a way, also develop relationships with themselves and get manipulated. And you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, but I'm curious how you organized social media for your children. Did you ever think about that?
Oh,
You know, to the
oh,
point
oh,
of saying, hey, like, what are we doing here?
yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. So you know about the cobbler's children who don't have shoes? I was
Mm,
the tech guy whose kids didn't have technology. They had the worst tech
right.
purpose.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
people who know who in Silicon Valley engineer the phones to be active and hurtful, they don't let their kids use it, because
Yeah.
they know the dangers more than anybody else. Whereas the rest of the world is like, oh, we got to get our kids online and da, da, da. They have schools where there's no technology,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's part. Just the thing, I was texting with a friend of mine who has young kids, and she was saying she was really happy with her kid asking for a smartphone. And there's
Mm,
this thing called Wait for Eighth, which is
yeah.
pledge like, so we wait for the eighth
Yeah.
grade to do that. My kids, when they were 11, they did a PowerPoint presentation saying 92% of their classmates have an iPhone. They had a dumb phone. And isn't that awful? And instead of, you know, digging in and saying, oh, we're like, oh, they know how to use PowerPoint. That's such a good life
That's right.
skill. They could have learned it 5 years later. Nobody cares. But
Yeah.
that's how dumb.
Yeah.
By the way, you might be surprised. I went through some effort to take my very fancy iPhone and turn it
Mm.
into a dumb phone. That's what it looks like
Oh,
when
I love it.
it only says messages, WhatsApp, phone, photos, Spotify. It has everything else in there.
Yeah.
What this is what a regular
I absolutely love that.
turn it into a screen,
Yeah.
because I think that we really need to be careful how we're using all this stuff. So I did this, but
Yeah. And I mean, it speaks to Dr. Murthy's,
yes,
amazing,
yes, yes. By the way, this apps,
imperatives.
your app, the app that if your listeners are curious,
It's called Dumb Phone. Okay, I got it. Yeah,
and
that's
you're
that's
praising
going.
Dr. Murthy. I wrote my newsletter about a couple of weeks ago. I said social media
I
is the
saw
new
that.
cigarettes, and that's
That's right.
directly praising Dr. Murthy for taking on this. And
Yeah.
anybody with young kids, what I say is every 6 months you delay your young teen getting on Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, you are postponing
Hmm.
severe issues by years. So
Oh yeah.
every everything will make a difference that you can do. Anything you can do will make a difference.
With that, this premise of ensuring that we are paying great attention to ourselves, we're harmonizing our relationships and not relegating them to a digital space or feeding into an algorithm, that's programmed to make us more addicted, and the smartphone versus dumb phone sort of idea. Within all the work that you've done, studying journalism, getting to be to the point where you can really embrace and also help people communicate digitally. All these hats, right? Helping people present, helping people communicate, serving as a dean, serving as a journalist, now serving as a leader in many spaces. I'm curious for you personally, what are some of the things that you had to, in fact, unlearn so that each of these incarnations could be successful?
Wow. And I presume this is the last. So you're ending with a
Yeah.
you started this way. Yeah, I mean, a lot. I consider myself someone who has had to unlearn many, many things along the way, the things that you're sure of. And that's one of the things you learn is that, like,
Yeah.
I gave up a job at Columbia where I loved every minute. I've been there 20 years. I understood every part of that campus and power structure, and I was part of the power structure. I walked away from that to go to the Met, where I would sit. I ran a 70-person team doing digital when I had no museum experience except as a person who went to museums, and I would be at meetings and I would have a notebook, and in it they would say words, and I wouldn't know if that word was a piece of software, a board member,
Right.
a donor. Like, I had no idea, and I'd be guessing phonetically. I'd just write out words, then I'd go back to my desk and just start furiously Googling. So
Yeah.
I was basically going to school every day to understand this entirely new world. It was, I can't tell you how humbling that was
Mm.
to own a domain. And then, because of your ownership of that domain, they said, okay, we need a storyteller, so we're going to bring you here. But you have to start from scratch. You have to
Yeah.
completely start from scratch. And that's very difficult. And for 3 magical years, I loved every moment at the Met. In fact, on Twitter, I have a hashtag 3 Met Years, the number 3 Met Years.
That's right.
If you look, I have
Yeah.
dozens of postings.
Yeah.
And then one day I was told, we're letting you go. And they got
Yeah.
rid of the chief digital officer, chief comms officer, and the chief design officer.
Yeah.
And we'd all started 3 months early. There were financial difficulties. I had to tell the world I've lost my job.
Yeah.
And it was, again, very humbling, but unlearning a lot of things is learning. And that's part of what makes you human and keeps you relevant.
Well, whether it's learning all the time, unlearning all the time, telling a series of jokes from the Soviet Union and translating that back to people, and more importantly, I think leading spaces where leadership is needed and curiosity is needed, and really developing great relationships. Sree, thank you so much for some time and really a great conversation. I hope we can visit with you again down the road.
Sure, we must end on a Soviet joke.
There
Uh,
you go.
Imagine me in my Russian English, Indian Russian English, be telling these stories.
Okay.
There was a foreign minister named Gromyko who in near the Kremlin, and there was a statue of Lenin there. And the statue of Lenin came to life and said to Gromyko, "Hey, Gromyko, my God, why? What? Yes, Mr. Lenin. What do you? I want you to get me a horse. I'm tired of standing. Can't you see that? You know, it was a standing pose." So he said, "Of
Yeah.
course." And then he went immediately to Brezhnev, the supreme Soviet leader, and said, "Lenin's statue has come to life." And so he rushes over with Brezhnev, and he comes over and he says, "Mr. Lenin, I've brought your spiritual successor, the supreme leader of the Soviet Union." And he looks at him and he says, "Gromyko, you idiot. I told you to bring me a horse and you brought me a donkey."
The apologies to the Leonid Brezhnev fans, but whoever you are out there, but we appreciate it anyways. Listen, Tree man, what a treat.
Thank you.
And hopefully more than anything else, much success to you down the road.